So Aisling, did you know that in almost all primitive languages, red is actually the first color to get a name?
No way. Did you also know that red is the first color that a baby can see?
So then, in many ways, red is not just a primary color, red is the primary color.
And a primary source of frustration for many painters.
Well, let's see what we can do about that then.
So, starting at the beginning, the very first reds were made in prehistoric times using red color soils.
And we still use earth tones today in like burnt sienna in our paintings.
And these were generally very muted, brownish reds. You don't really start to see brilliant reds until around the Roman times. And the Romans loved their brilliant reds.
They certainly did.
They used minium, of one of the first sources of brilliant red paint. Unfortunately, it was procured by roasting lead, basically.
Yeah, white lead. And they also had a more expensive red extracted from a mineral called cinnabar, which is also known as vermilion. It was highly toxic. They used it in even cosmetics, not realizing how toxic it was.
So that was natural vermilion, not to be confused with synthetic vermilion, which was brought over by, I think, the Chinese.
That's right. In fact, it's even called Chinese red often. And painters like Titian would have used it, and it was quite famous for the reds in his paintings.
So the next development of red pigment didn't really happen until centuries later, when the Europeans started exploring the New World, and they discovered that the Aztecs had a beautiful bright red that they got from basically grinding down an insect called the cochineal.
And did you know that it was actually the third most valuable export from the New World to the Old World after gold and silver?
Today you might recognize this as Crimson Lake or Carmine, and painters like Vermeer and Rembrandt were known to use these pigments.
And that was it until pretty much the 20th century, when cadmium red was finally invented.
Cadmium also got a bad rep for being highly toxic. But studies have shown that it's actually not the case.
Yes, cadmium is a heavy metal and is highly toxic, but there just isn't enough of it in modern paints to represent a meaningful health hazard. I wouldn't put it in my sandwiches either.
There are other issues with cadmium red. Well, out of the tube, directly out of the tube, it gives you a beautiful true red that's nice and opaque. But when you mix it with white, it starts to sort of go towards a dusky color.
It does, and one of the solutions for that is some painters use cadmium red light, either in addition to their cadmium red or instead of it. Cadmium red light, however, is kind of on the orangey side of the spectrum, so it can't really be your one and only red.
Naphthol could be considered a good substitute. Naphthol has very good tinting strength.
It has, and Grumbacher sell it as Grumbacher Red. It's semi-opaque though, so it doesn't really cover as well as cadmium red.
So those are the warm reds. As you can see, they all come with their own little quirk. What about the cooler reds?
Well, Alizarin Crimson has been the go-to cool red for a long time now. It's got very good tinting strength. It is quite transparent, so it's terrific for glazes, and it mixes wonderfully with Viridian or a Talo green or something like that to provide nice neutral glazes. The problem is that some people believe it's fugitive though.
Meaning it's not very light fast. In other words, it fades in the sunlight.
Yeah, now this may be true for watercolors. I've used Alizarin Crimson for many years. I've never seen any sign of color fading. But regardless of what you might think, the color companies are ceasing to produce it. So you might find it actually hard to find the thing and be forced to look for an alternative.
Permanent alizarin has sort of been suggested as an alternative, but it is by no means a perfect match to alizarin.
Certainly not. For one thing, I just don't like the way it comes out of the tube. It's not nearly as dark as original Alizarin Crimson. And it goes very pinkish when you start adding white.
You could also try something in the Quinacridone family or the Quin family, like Quin Crimson, Quin Violet, Quin Rose. Confusingly, they all have the same reference number, which I believe is PV19, but they are all very, very different from one another.
Yes, they are. So what other reds are out there?
Pyrrole red is also quite popular. Winsor and Newton sell it as Winsor Red. I've also seen it advertised as simply bright red.
Yes, bright red. It's not as opaque as cadmium red, so it suffers the same issues as naphthol red in that you just don't get the same covering power that you get with cad red.
So there are lots of reds out there, and it is more than a bit confusing. So if you're starting out and you want to keep things simple, what reds would you recommend?
Well, given that there's no such thing as a perfect red, you probably have to go with at least two, and so you probably want one warm red and one cool red.
For us, we usually go for the cad red for the warm reds, and then we love the alizarin to get us a cool red.
If the issues about light fastness of the Alizarin Crimson concerns you, or if you're just finding it hard to find, then I would go with one of the quinacridones instead.
But not permanent alizarin?
No, maybe it's just a personal thing, but I just don't like the fact that it's so light out of the tube and that pinky kind of color you get from it.
It is great though if you're trying to get a Pepto-Bismol
Yes,
pink.
wonderful. And if you don't like the way cadmium red loses that intensity when you add white, then my first choice would be to add cad red light to your palette.
And lots of people really love the pyrrole reds or the naphthol reds, and they are definitely easier on the wallet as well.
That's certainly true. So I think that about wraps it up for the reds, and I hope it helped to demystify the color for you.
If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to keep up to date with our content.
And keep safe and keep painting.
Bye!